Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Food Safety Office Hours. I'm your moderator, Sam Alkin, Associate Professor in the Department of Food Science. Sometimes repeated exposure to something you enjoy can lead to adverse reactions, like the one I just had this week with the snow squalls in spring. It's kind of similar to allergens, where avoidance is really the only solution for those afflicted. So while I Zillow homes in San Diego, we're going to hear from a great panel of experts. They'll be talking about the different types of controls we have as food manufacturers to control allergens and ensure that we deal with risks like cross contact, ensure that we're communicating inherent allergens in our products to the consumers, and overall ensuring the safety of our products and the health of our consumers. So we'll be having a couple presentations today. The first will be from Sarah Czapranski, who is the New York State works at the New York State Department of Ag and Markets in the Division of Food Safety and Inspection. She is the supervising food inspector in the Division of Food Safety and Inspection at Ag and Market. She's been there for over 10 years, working in the compliance unit as a field inspector and in various other capacities, including complaints coordinators, which I'm sure she hears a lot of, and contract manager. Since 2021, she has been the preventative controls program coordinator, managing the implementation of preventative control inspections here in New York State. So glad to have you here, Sarah. We also will have Dr. Steve Gendel, who is an internationally recognized expert on food allergen control, allergenicity assessment for new food proteins, and on the use and understanding of allergen testings. His experience includes over 2 decades developing science and policy in the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. He was the first FDA food allergen coordinator and contributed to the creation of the Preventive Controls for Human Foods rule, the gluten-free labeling rule, and agency guidance documents on allergen controls. He's also provided support to FDA inspection and enforcement programs, and currently Dr. Gendel, with his consulting company, is working to help food manufacturers leverage food safety to support the success and sustainability of their products through data-informed approaches. So I'm glad to have the two of them on the panel afterwards. We'll also have Dr. Jeremy Alder joining us. He's a technical service lead at Ecolab with a focus on helping companies troubleshoot food safety and quality challenges, including allergens. He's led R&D and innovation programs and brings a food safety and technology perspective that spans from the ideal benchtop to the messy real world. So glad to have the panel here today. As we're listening to this, I know many of you have already submitted questions that we will be getting to, but if you have questions that come up, feel free. There's a chat box at the bottom where if you press that little icon, a little chat box will pop up. You can type in your question there. You can send it to everyone, or you can send it just to me, and then I'll read it out during the Q&A section. So thank you very much. And with that, I will pass it on to Sarah.
Thank you very much, Sam. Let me get the PowerPoint up. Does everybody see the slides?
Yes, we do.
Looks good.
Oh, fantastic. All right. So thank you for the introduction. I've been kind of a fan of these food safety office hours since they started, and I'm a little starstruck to be on the other side actually presenting. So hopefully I can be helpful to everybody here today. I don't think I'm an expert, but I've been doing this long enough to know that there's a lot that I don't know. And I think that's a kind of expertise. I relied on our team in the Division of Food Safety to put this information together, and hopefully we'll be able to rely on the team to answer any questions that we have come up too. What I have prepared today is just a brief overview of food allergens. It's pretty basic and high level, nothing really specific. So I'm going to start just by talking about what we think of as the hazards associated with food allergens, essentially what we're trying to prevent. The major laws and regulations that are in place, those are the tools we have as regulators to be able to take action if someone's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, what our inspectors are doing when they're in your facility, what they're looking for, and then a little bit of information, some links just if people want to get more in depth on any of those topics. So when we think about food allergens as regulators, we tend to break them up into 2 hazards. Essentially, we want to prevent people, of course, from consuming something that they're allergic to. I don't think I need to explain to anybody here how dangerous that can be. I think we all know that when someone has a food allergy, it's not just that, they're going to have unpleasant side effects. It very often can lead to death. So it's something we need to take very seriously. We talk about these two hazards: undeclared food allergens due to incorrect label and unintended food allergen presence due to allergen cross contact. So the first one, of course, lots of us enjoy eating things that are considered major food allergens in the United States. And if we're not allergic to them, that's great. We can enjoy our peanut butter and our gluten and everything else. So that first hazard is essentially, if you're making a product on purpose that has a major food allergen in it, you need to take steps to make sure that it's properly labeled and consumers who do have an allergy can avoid it. Now, the second one is if, say, you're a facility that's processing a product that has some major food allergens, and then you also process products that either have different major food allergens or no major food allergens, you need to take steps to make sure that allergens that aren't supposed to be in one product and are supposed to be in another aren't winding up in the product that they're not supposed to be in. So preventing allergen cross contact. And then here, the last one I have is just chemical hazards due to misformulation. So in the US right now, we have 9 major food allergens. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But there are also a lot of other substances that go into foods that people may have sensitivities or allergies to that aren't considered major food allergens. And controlling this hazard, that's one of the ways that we look out for those consumers, is just making sure that if these substances are in the product, they're on the label, and if they're not supposed to be in the product, they're not in the product. So what laws and regulations are in place to make sure that these hazards are controlled? What requires a food facility to do their part in making sure consumers don't accidentally take a bite of something that could really hurt them? So these regulations on this slide apply to most food manufacturers, or really nearly all food manufacturers. And I do want to point out there's a little bit of regulator speak when I say food manufacturer. The way that a hazard's going to be ultimately controlled is really the same if you're at retail or at wholesale, but the regulatory foundation is going to be different. And these slides are focused on food manufacturers. And when I say my regulator speak for a food manufacturer, what I mean is someone who's manufacturing a product and selling it at wholesale. So I'm talking about a manufacturing facility and not so much like a deli or a grocery store or a restaurant. And again, the hazards are the same. The way they're going to be controlled is pretty much the same. It's just the regulations are different. These regulations are for manufacturers. So the very first one on the list here is our CGMP, or our current good manufacturing practice regulation. It's 21 CFR 117, subpart B. If you are still using 110, please put it away and get a copy of 117. When we look at subpart B, that's the piece of 117 that most directly replaces 110. And if you read through 117, we talk about allergen cross contact quite a bit, more or less at every sort of step and every sort of section in it. It talks about the need to prevent allergen cross contact. So that's that second hazard from the first slide. So making sure that if you're manufacturing a product that's not supposed to have an allergen in it, it doesn't wind up in that product. The second regulation, or rather act, that we have listed here is the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004, or FELCPA. And it basically lays out how the 8 major food allergens need to be declared on a label. So we've got a quote from the act here: milk, egg, fish, crustacean, shellfish, tree nuts, wheat, peanuts, and soybeans. So the act talks about how these products need to be declared on the label. It also defines what a major food allergen is. So these are the 8 major food allergens that we're all familiar with. And then the last act here that I have, the Food Allergen Safety, Treatment, Education, and Research Act of 2021, also known as FASTER, added sesame as the 9th major food allergen. So now we have these 9 major food allergens. We have requirements for them to be declared on the label using their common name. And then these are the 9 major food allergens that when our inspectors go into your facility, they're making sure you're controlling cross contact for. So when you're reading subpart B and it talks about major food allergens, these are the 9 things it's referring to. So as Sam said in my introduction, I mostly work on preventive controls implementation. So everything I talk about gets a little bit of a preventive controls flavor to it. So I'm going to talk really briefly about some of the preventive controls requirements and how they would apply to controlling those allergen hazards that we talked about. This really is only going to apply to our medium to large food manufacturers. If you're what we talk about as a qualified facility or a very small business, meaning less than $1 million in annual sales of human food, this really isn't going to apply to you. You're still going to need to control those hazards using the GMPs, but this extra sort of administrative and paperwork requirements you're not going to have to do. If you're over that $1 million threshold, you are going to have to do this. So it's good to pay attention. So we talked about subpart B of 117, and here I'm going to talk briefly about subparts C and G. When you hear the phrase preventive controls, subparts C and G of 117 are the regulations that we're referring to. I know subpart C is the only part that actually says preventive controls in its title, but subpart G is part of it too. And if you're subject to subpart C, you're also subject to subpart G. So for our larger food manufacturers, if you are making that product that's supposed to have major allergens, like our peanut butter, you need to make sure that it's got the right label on it. If you're subject to preventive controls, that labeling step's going to be a preventive control. And if you're making products that have different allergenic profiles and you're making sure you're avoiding cross contact, that avoidance of cross contact is also going to need to be a preventive control. Depending on what you have going on in your facility, you might consider it an allergen preventive control, you might consider it a sanitation preventive control, but basically you're going to need to have a written procedure and keep records to show that you are preventing allergen cross contact. Now, subpart G is where it gets kind of interesting, stuff that people aren't necessarily used to. If you are manufacturing a product, presumably you're receiving ingredients from somewhere. So what subpart G requires you to do is to control hazards in those ingredients through a supplier verification activity. In the regulation, we talk about basically serious hazards, and those hazards needing to be controlled through a supplier verification activity that is an on-site audit or an equivalent. We don't really have a definition for equivalent, so I'm just going to say on-site audit. And when we're looking at allergen hazards, these are very serious hazards. So as we talked about in the beginning, they're things that can kill people and kill them very quickly. So this is something we need to take very seriously. What that looks like for you as a manufacturer trying to comply with subpart G, you got to get some information from your suppliers about what they're doing in their facility in terms of allergens. So if you know that your supplier is handling different allergens than what you're expecting to have in your product, possibly on shared equipment, you're going to need to have a supplier verification activity in place just to make sure that you're using a supplier who's doing what they need to do in order to control allergens as well. So what can you expect from our inspectors when they're coming into your facility? We're walking around, we're asking questions, we're sometimes standing there for an awkward amount of time, staring at something. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? So I'm going to kind of walk through it, starting in the ingredient storage area as far as allergens are concerned. And again, this is really narrow, just talking about allergen hazards. In your storage areas, we're going to be looking to make sure that if you're using allergenic ingredients, so ingredients that have any of those 9 major allergens, they should be stored segregated from the other ingredients. They should be in closed containers, and they should be labeled so that your employees know that these are allergenic products. When we're actually out on your processing floor, we're going to be asking questions about scheduling and sequencing. Basically, what we want to know is when you set up your production schedule for that day, are you intentionally processing products maybe that don't contain any major allergens before you process products that do? Is that part of how you have a strategy to overall control allergen cross contact. When you do have shared equipment between products with different allergenic profiles, are you actually cleaning and sanitizing that equipment between products containing unique allergens? And in general, are all operations conducted in such a way that you're avoiding allergen cross contact? So if you're scaling ingredients in one area, are you making sure that allergenic ingredients are still kept separate? Are your employees going back and forth between a line with allergens and without allergens without changing gloves and aprons? That kind of thing. And then, of course, finally, we're looking at your labels. So we want to see that allergens are properly being declared on labels. We might go back into your ingredient storage area and pay really close attention to the ingredients that are in your ingredients, so your sub-ingredients, and then ask for the label that you're using for that finished product so that we can make sure that all of the allergens in your ingredients are declared on your finished product label. We also may kind of stand in some part of your facility and kind of awkwardly watch you guys for a while. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. It is awkward for us. I know it's awkward for you guys. What we're looking for is just to see what's actually going on. So we're not trying to stand there just until you do something wrong. We're trying to stand there long enough that we can understand what you're doing. We can see the patterns. We can understand why this employee is doing this and not that, what everybody's role is. And we're trying just as much to catch you doing something right. So when we're standing there, that's what we're up to. It's nothing terribly nefarious. So again, a little bit of preventive controls flavor. If you are a firm in New York State who's subject to preventive controls, not every single time one of our inspectors comes into your facility are they going to be doing a full scope preventive controls inspection. But when they are, they're going to be asking to see your written procedures that are relevant to preventive controls and any associated records. They're going to make sure that those controls are appropriate for controlling the hazards, as well as potentially for those other substances we talked about, along with the major allergens, and just anything else that's relevant to the control of the allergen hazards. During either of these kinds of inspections, the inspector may also take samples. And then here I've just got some resources. That was just a really brief overview of what we want to prevent, what regulations we have in place, and what you can expect from our inspectors. These links are to the regulations, the acts, and some guidance documents that you might find helpful. So we've just got the text of the FALCPA Act, FDA's guide on food allergen labeling, another food labeling guide from FDA, our own New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets website with food labeling information, the text of 117, so all of the subparts. And then if you're subject to PC, we've got the draft guidance for industry. And that's all I have. I can turn it back over.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's good to know exactly what you're doing when you're standing there watching us all that time. It's good to have that perspective. Yeah. Thanks. Well, then we're going to pass it over to Steve to kind of talk us more through allergens and what we should be thinking about.
Great, thank you very much. And there it is, share my screen. And you can confirm to me that you can see my screen?
Yeah, seeing your screen.
Oh, good. So in listening to Sarah, I had to admit that it was sort of some thoughts that went through my mind. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I worked for FDA for a long time. And I left to get more involved in the world of consulting and being able to work in a more straightforward manner, I guess you could say, with the industry, with people making foods, at about the time that FSMA implementation was coming along. And I knew it was going to be a big deal for people to figure out how to do this, and that allergens were going to be an issue. But quite frankly, at that time, I thought for sure by now I'd be out of business. I would need to be getting a job at McDonald's or something like that to pay the rent, that this would not be going on. But it clearly, when you look at the world of recalls in particular, allergen control continues to be a problem, an issue, opportunity, and not just in the US, but all over the world. allergen-related food recalls are at or near the top of the reasons for recalls everywhere that has records about that. So one of the things that I've tried to do is to look at this from the point of view of manufacturers and to ask the question of sort of how can you think about this in a way that makes it easy for a manufacturer to understand. And in doing that, I realized there's really three key principles for manufacturers when it comes to what they need to do in their shops, on the manufacturing floor, in their facilities to control allergens. And it boils down to knowing what it is you make, knowing what you say about what you make, and knowing what it is that you actually do in your processes when you're making your products. Not a very complicated idea. It's one that people should be able to handle. So let's look. Is this going to work? Here we go. Trying to get my cursor in the right place. There we go. So let's look at the question is knowing what you make is about the allergens you intend to have in your products. And that really means knowing about two different things. One is your formulas or recipes, whatever you call them, and what you actually do when you're producing your products on the floor in the factory. So then the way to look at whether you really know what you're doing or what's happening is to ask some questions. And here's some examples of questions that you can ask yourself that'll be helpful. And one of them, has anything changed? I've seen a lot of situations where companies have done a pretty good analysis of their formulas or recipes when they develop a new product, but then things change. Their suppliers change. Maybe they change their recipes to use some new ingredients. They don't think about looking back at their allergen controls and other allergen-related activities in light of those changes. When it comes to product development, formulation, don't add new allergens if it can be avoided. If you have a facility that uses, for instance, almonds, and you're considering adding Brazil nuts, for instance, ask yourself very carefully, do you need to actually add a different allergen? Do you need to have a product line with something different on it? It's not to say you can't or shouldn't, but you should ask yourself very carefully about the extra burden that having more allergens and more complex processes will create versus the advantage of having those extra products. And finally, the production part. You really need to look very carefully at what you do during production to make sure you control your ingredients. This is not just the simple things about, we mentioned, Sarah mentioned the cross contact, but actually the ingredients that you intend to have in your product. Are you taking the right ingredients out of storage? Are they being properly identified if you have to weigh them or do some other separations with them? Are you sure that the right ingredients are brought to the production line and added in? So those are some examples of some of the questions it's worth thinking about when it comes to the principle of knowing what you make. Then there's the next principle, which is knowing what you say, which again is about your intended allergens. And that comes down to your label designs and label controls. And one at the top of the list is the current label design accurate? And that goes back to the question I asked on the last slide about, is the product that you're making now exactly the same as the one that you were making when you designed your label? And that means both your formula and what's happening with your suppliers. If your suppliers have changed a mix, if they've added a different flow control agent, any one of a number of different things could be happening that would affect whether your labels are actually currently accurate. When it comes to the actual physical label itself, if you have them printed by an outside printer, and this could be If you have stick-on plastic labels, it could be if you have boxes, it could be if you get packages, containers that are already pre-printed. Be sure you check very carefully what you get and do that check every single time. And don't just check the top of whatever batch of labels that you get. So if you get a pallet with a bunch of boxes on it, don't just check the top box. Make sure that at some point along the way, you check a couple of other times along as you use the boxes, or if you have a large roll of labels that gets put on in a label attachment machine, that you check along as that label is being used, that it's always the same. If you print your labels in-house, double check the templates and controls and the software that runs your in-house label printers. I've seen situations where people who shouldn't be allowed access to the software or to some of the information on recipes have inadvertently changed the information about a recipe in a software system at a manufacturer and caused their labels to be inaccurate when they were printed. So you have to control what you do, and you have to make sure your printers or outside suppliers are controlling what they're into. And then the third principle of know what you do. This applies to both intended and unintended allergens. Those principles, the supplier controls, cross-contact controls, and cleaning controls. So I don't really need to go into this a whole lot because Sarah did a great job, but you need to be sure that your information about your suppliers is up to date and accurate. This is something, again, suppliers change, they reformulate, they do things differently. So make sure you know what your supplier is doing today, not what they did last year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago when you onboarded them. Cross-contact controls, that's basically separation in time and or space for products and ingredients that contain different allergens. So it's pretty straightforward concept. Just make sure that things are kept separate from each other. And that could be maybe by sequencing your production. Maybe it can be by using equipment in different parts of the facility. And it can also be controlling dust and so on. And finally, cleaning. And I want to make sure that I mention the fact that I say cleaning and not cleaning and sanitation. For allergen control, it's not a matter of sanitation. You can have a surface which is sanitary because you've done something to inactivate or kill microbes, but it still has protein residues present, which could cause cross contact for allergens. So you have to remember that cleaning means removing protein residues. And you need to work with your supplier, cleaning the chemical supplier, to make sure that the chemicals that you're using are appropriate for removing proteins from your surfaces and that you're using it appropriately for that purpose. That may mean adjusting temperatures, it may mean adjusting dilution factors, or it may mean adjusting how long you leave a chemical in contact with the surface. Documentation. I've left this slide blank because the bottom line here is just like everything else you do, you have to document your preventive controls, your HACCP plans, your production controls. All of those things require documentation. They all need to include the allergen control aspects of all of that. And one of the things that I will say here, especially if you're a reasonable sized company, you have people who are tracking every single penny that comes in and goes out in great detail. You need to think about doing the same kind of tracking of your ingredients and your products in order to preserve both quality and safety of those products. And if it isn't in a document, it didn't happen. So overall message, mastering allergen control is not really a secret. It's not as hard as it sounds because allergen control is very much like what you do for quality control. You want to make sure that you're in control of your inputs and your processes and your labels because that's what makes up the quality of your product. And this is what the consumer sees. So the same kinds of controls, the same things you think about and test for that are the same things you need to do to control allergens in your facility. And also, it's really important you prevent problems, because once an allergen is in the system, unlabeled allergen or inappropriate allergen, you can't fix it. Again, unlike microbes, you can't treat your product, your ingredients to remove allergens once they're there. So it's much better to prevent problems. And besides, it's a lot cheaper and easier to prevent problems than it is to try to clean them up afterwards. And one last principle I think that really applies, especially when you think about supply chain controls, is trust a little, but verify a lot. Don't take things for granted. And that applies, frankly, to all aspects of your safety quality control systems. So I just want to mention that there's help available. Again, it's not really as hard as you think it is, but there are people like me who are available to help you walk through or to look at your system and see whether or not you've got it right. And at that, I will stop my slides and turn it back over to Sam. Are we turning it back to you?
Yeah, back to me. Thanks, Steve.